It's been a common argument around the Star Wars fan community ever since the prequel series debuted. What does the Chosen One prophecy actually mean? And is Anakin really the Chosen One? Well, my personal take is that, though Anakin may be the one spoken of in the prophecy, he demonstrably did not destroy the Sith, and there is no such thing as bringing balance to the Force, at least not from a traditional Jedi perspective. Now, before anyone jumps down my throat, let me explain. But first, a quick disclaimer. As should hopefully go without saying, this will be to the absolute exclusion of any Disney Star Wars material, as that is not now, nor has it ever been canon, meaning I will not be taking the Master and Apprentice novels version, which you can read on screen, into account. And since this is the only version I'm aware of that explicitly mentions a virgin birth, the question of who the Chosen One is, or whether the prophecy itself can be considered legitimate, still hangs tenuously in the balance. As Obi-Wan points out in the Episode 3 novelization, regardless of its original source or wording, the Chosen One has become, for all intents and purposes, a Jedi legend, and so would naturally have a Jedi-centric bias, likewise for the Sith's prophecy of the Sith Ari. And as with all religious fables, both real and fictional, it would naturally elevate the Jedi worldview and philosophy as the true and correct one that would ultimately win out in the end, and would just assume it as a given that their savior would naturally be one of their own, even though the prophecy itself makes no mention thus. Hence why they were so distrustful of Anakin, as he wasn't raised in the temple, trained in their ways since birth as the rest of them were. They viewed him as an outsider. To get you to understand why I believe Luke is the Chosen One, and why the rest of the Jedi prophecy is an aggrandizing religious farce, at least insofar as it portends the proverbial end of history, I'm going to tell you this video's thesis, and then walk you backwards through my reasoning. To wit, nobody brought balance to the Force. Not Luke, nor Anakin. There's no such thing. Saying you'll balance the Force itself is like saying you'll enlighten God. To imagine that such a thing is even possible, let alone that they are qualified to do it, in my view, just epitomizes the hubris of the old Jedi Order. No, the Chosen One was never meant to bring balance to the Force, but rather to bring balance to those who wield it, namely the Jedi Order, and in so doing ultimately defeat the Sith, not by destroying them in a direct conflict, as the old Jedi Order imagined, but by simply denying their ideology sufficient purchase on the hearts and minds of Force wielders. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, to understand that, we must learn why the Jedi and Sith orders keep cyclically rising and failing, as well as where the schism between them really came from in the first place. To do this, we'll need to examine the core contradictions in both the Jedi and Sith codes. You'll notice that, save for the last line, which we'll come back to in a moment, if taken at face value, the Jedi Code is not only objectively, factually wrong, but totally absurd on even the most elementary level of deductive reasoning. That's because it's not meant to be read as a literal statement of fact, but as, in effect, an ideological wish list. To say there is no emotion but peace is to say no more or less than, I wish it were so. But wishes do not reality make. Something the Sith are all too eager to point out with their code seminal line, peace is a lie, there is only passion. In truth, war and conflict are the default state of life in the universe, sentient, or force-sensitive, or otherwise. This is undeniable. Suffering and death are just parts of nature, and nobody thinks to ascribe any labels to it when it doesn't directly impact their lives. Does the Vornskir hate the Ysalamiri it hunts? Do the Ysalamiri hate the predators who prey upon them? Is the woodsman evil for cutting down trees to build his house? Is a wildfire an agent of darkness for decimating the forest? When their house gets burned down, some would understandably say yes, though others would ascribe it to luck.
In my experience, there's no such thing as luck.
Creation and destruction, life and death. These are both necessary facets of existence, hence the Jedi Code's closing statement. There is no death, there is the Force. In the Star Wars galaxy, this is objectively true, and if we take the Force to be an analog of nature itself, then we can also say this is factually accurate in our own universe as well. Nothing ever truly goes away, at least not entirely. It's all recycled in the great circle of life. So what then delineates the dark side from the light if they're both just two halves of the same coin? Well, first of all, remember too that the dark and light sides are Jedi-made delineations also. And second, to know that, we'll have to examine the dark side's most fundamentalist lieutenants, specifically those who pioneered the whole ordeal. To slightly paraphrase the Star Wars New Essential Chronology book, among the Jedi Order, a cadre of Darksiders made a significant discovery. Force of sufficient intensity could bend life itself. They pioneered the twisted science of dark side mutations, and the century-long war that followed was known as the 100-Year Darkness. The exiled Jedi raised an animalistic army, some of their soldiers monstrous, others merely pitiful. The Dark Lords made a last stand on Korbos, where Jedi hunters and evil rivals obliterated most of them. The surviving Dark Lords fled beyond the Republic's borders, emerging in uncharted space where they discovered the Sith species. The reason I bring this passage up is to illustrate what Kyle Katarn, a famed student of Luke's Jedi Academy who's had his share of brushes with the dark side, meant when he said, "Abilities are not inherently good or evil, it's how you use them." The Jedi of oldest antiquity did not fear or even reject the dark side of the Force as such, but merely denounced its adherents' most extreme attempts to play God. Like the Jedi, the contradiction in the Sith code, appropriately enough, lies in its closing line, "The Force shall free me." They claim to be the path to breaking all chains, but ironically rely upon the very Force that put those chains upon them in the first place in order to do so, and so they inevitably spiral into self-destructive, self-consumptive oblivion, pulling everything and everyone else down into the void along with them. So what we have in the end is a battle, not between light and dark in a cosmic sense, but of pure ungrounded idealism versus the height of cynical nihilism. And here's where my theory enters its conclusive phase. All of the most pivotal characters in Star Wars history, from Kreia to Revan, to Mitra to Luke and Kyle, have all drank deeply of both the light and dark side fonts. The key is that they all resisted the pull to the utmost heights of Sith evil, as well as towards hypocritical Jedi autocracy. They were balanced, a simile for which is temperance, meaning not too much of any one thing, which is where the prophecy comes back into the picture. The Jedi of old feared the temptations of the dark side, the fallibility of the mortal will, recoiling from it with such force as to come to vilify the very thought of individual volition, claiming to submit their own personal wills and agendas to that of the Force itself, sort of like how religious fundamentalists claim to follow God's will. This is an absurdist lie since, as alluded to at the start, they're not omniscient. They can't follow the will of the Force because they don't know the will of the Force, as they themselves tacitly admit through their use of the phrase, "May the Force be with you." Refusing to admit their fallibility for their arrogance, but also refusing to adopt an actionable stance for their piety, what they did instead was outsource their agency to a political body, the Republic Senate, and to their own dogmatic council, who, in the wise words of Darth Plagueis, executed the business of the Republic as though it were the business of the Force, all the while sitting in a literal ivory tower located on a planet completely subsumed by the synthetic artifices of pride, greed, and ambition. It is not possible to be a living being without also having a mind, and anything that has a mind also has a will. It has desires, and thus it will form attachments. The Jedi of the Old Order became attached to the Order itself, and by extension the Republic, and so, predictably, became dependent upon it, and so became its gullible tools, and by extension the Siths, an error Luke Skywalker's Jedi Order would not repeat. I've said before on this channel that power does not corrupt, but merely enables. A fundamentally good and honest person won't magically become a sadistic tyrant the first time they get angry. Likewise, a megalomaniacal despot will naturally seek and work to own the entire universe, whether he has telekinetic powers or not. The simple, hard reality of the matter is that nature, a la the Force, does not create good or evil, but those with maleficent tendencies will always crave the power, the ability, to enact those ends. And so rather than restraining the good, forcing them to remain passive, and thus making them impotent to stop the rise and spread of evil until after it's already too late, Luke Skywalker instead worked to not merely empower the just and righteous, but to also instill them with a sense of moral duty and purpose, conceding the fact that individuals would have their own agendas, but hoping that their combined light would overpower the darkest of shadows, both internally and externally, while also accepting that they could never burn away the darkness entirely. Also, for those of you who are going to say that I'm fanboying over Grey Jedi, you're correct, but also not. It's complicated. Though there are several variations on the Grey Jedi code, the one on screen is what I personally most agree with. But as always, this is all just my opinion. Let me know yours in the comments, and while you're there, if you feel I deserve it, consider also dropping a super thanks or super chat coin in my hat. Check out my books on Amazon if you're a fan of existential science fantasy conundrums. And as always, until next time, stay safe, stay sane, and remember,
The Force will be with you, always.